The big patch for Season 1 hit today, and with it comes a lot of changes for the Necromancer, specifically the BloodLancer. A lot of great changes for the BloodLancer. So much so that it has become one of my favorite ways to play the Necromancer. So in this video, we're going to present the BloodLancer Necromancer. No time to waste. Let's get into it. So typical caveats before we get started, the gameplay above is not specially farm nightmare dungeons. They are, 46, 47 nightmare dungeons. We're just farming with these. And some of you guys might ask, why would you make this build guide now with the Malignant Hearts coming in Season 1? I wanted to make this build guide without any sort of Malignant Heart, without any sort of gimmicks, because as far as we know right now, Malignant Hearts will not be rolling over into the base game. So this build guide will be strictly on what is in the base game and the best way to play BloodLancer in the game right now. And of course, you're going to be able to do crazy stuff with the Malignant Hearts and, definitely stop by the stream when the season launches and get some updates on that. But we wanted to present this as a non-seasonal build. All right. So as always, we're going to sort of present the build guide to you guys. And then at the end of the video, we'll have like a bunch of like tips and tricks and little quirks and things to know. But there's actually quite a bit of little nuances to this build, especially with Blood and the Necromancer. And we're going to deep dive into all that. So buckle up. Okay, so starting with the skill tree, as always, we're going to put 2 points into Hemorrhage, 1 point into the base skill, and 1 point into Enhanced Hemorrhage. Now, normally for a lot of the builds we've been making, we basically just had to put these 2 points to make it to the next tier. But this is actually sort of important. And you might ask why, because it's definitely not on my skill bar. While you're leveling with this and while you're sort of progressing your character's power, it might be necessary, in fact, it might even be preference, to put Hemorrhage on your bar over Bone Storm. Just on boss kills. It can make the boss kills so much more smooth. And you really have to play bosses perfectly in this build to not run out of essence. But if you play them perfectly, you don't have to worry about it. But again, as you're leveling, as you're increasing your power, you might want to put the Hemorrhage on the bar just for the boss kills. And definitely things like world bosses and stuff like that. Moving on to what this build is all about. That's right, the BloodLancer. We're going to put a maximum of 5 points into that skill. We're going to put a point into Enhanced BloodLancer. That's part of what makes a BloodLancer sort of pop off. If they're already Lance, it'll pierce through them. And then lastly, we're putting a point into Supernatural BloodLancer, which says after casting BloodLancer 6 times, the BloodLancer will be a guaranteed overpower. More on overpower later. We're going to put 3 points into Hewed Flesh. We are scaling Lucky Hit in this build. Corpses are a big part of this build, and you'll see exactly why as we dive into the gear section. We're going to put 1 point into Unliving Energy to get 3 points into Imperfectly Balanced. Imperfectly Balanced increases our core skill cost, but at the cost of making it more expensive to cast. And this does scale overpower damage, so it makes it quite good. There is currently a bug in the game right now where I can't put 3 points into it, but that's sort of why it looks like this. Moving on, a big part of this build is Blood Mist, which is actually insane in this build. Pop 1 point into that and then get the Enhanced Blood Mist, which makes it so that anytime you cast a skill that overpowers, the cooldown is reduced by 2. And of course, we are an overpowered build, so this is quite good. And then lastly, we're going into Ghastly Blood Mist, and we'll explain this in sort of the skill rotation part of the video. But this just makes it so our initial setup of monster packs is just silky smooth. We do not take the Dreadful Blood Mist for the Fortify. We've got plenty of ways to stack Fortify, and we'll get into that, of course, as well. Moving on, a full 5 points into Corpse Explosion, and a point in Enhanced Corpse Explosion to increase the radius. And then finally, Plague Corpse Explosion will basically deal 8% more damage to enemies that are slowed, stunned, or vulnerable, and they stack. Now, again, we are not going to be applying vulnerable in this build, and that you might seem crazy because literally almost every build in the game applies vulnerable or stacks vulnerable, but overpower does not. And again, we'll get into that later. But at least we'll get 16% increased damage, even though we're not applying vulnerable. And again, Corpse Explosion is going to be a huge part of this build, and we'll dive into that in the gear section. Put a full 3 points into Grim Harvest. That makes it so every single time we consume a corpse, we're going to get 6 essence, and that is literally the most important part. One of the most important aspects of this build is to consume those corpses and to get essence. So this is an absolute must. We're going to put 3 points into Fuel by Death. We'll be consuming a ton of corpses in this build, so getting that flat damage mod for our Blood Spear is really good. And then finally, surprisingly, one of my favorite skills in this game, Bone Prison, is just insane here. We're going to put 1 point in the Bone Prison. Of course, we're going to put a point into Enhanced Bone Prison. This recently got buffed, so now it applies 25 essence if you just trap something, and an additional 5 essence per enemy trap. And this is going to be, again, a huge way that we're going to be generating essence. Because again, we're not running any essence generators here. Lastly, we're using the Fortify, the Dreadful Bone Prison. This thing is nutty for generating Fortify. instant fortify on demand, exactly when you need it. And this build is all about having fortify and being healthy. And a lot of our overpowered damage is dependent on fortify. Moving on, we're going to take Death's Reach. This is 12% increased damage to distant enemies. And this is actually its own multiplier, which is kind of weird. You would think it would just be like the distant enemy damage you get on gear, but for some reason this is a separate multiplier. So this is actually quite good. Moving down, we are a blood build. So we're going to take 1 point in gruesome mending. We don't need any additional points in that. We just need to get to the next tier. We're going to put 3 points in the coalesce blood. So while healthy, your blood skills deal additional damage. We're going to be healthy like 95% of the time. Tides of blood, your blood skills deal 50% increased overpowered damage. This bonus is damage while you're healthy. And again, we're going to be healthy. So we're going to get 30% increased damage to blood skills. We are not going to be taking Drain Vitality, again, because there are great ways of applying Fortify in this build, and we'll get into more of that later. And then another key feature of this build, we're going to take Corpse Tendrils. We're going to put 1 point in the Corpse Tendrils, enhance Corpse Tendrils, of course. And then we're going to use Blighted Corpse Tendrils because they have a 35% chance to drop a Blood Orb. Blood Orbs are going to be a big key part of this build. Moving down to the ultimate side of the tree, we're going to pick up Bone Storm, Prime Bone Storm, Supreme Bone Storm, getting additional crit. Crit chance is super important in this build, but we don't care about crit damage. And then the flat 15% damage reduction while Bone Storm is active is just plain good. And you'll see why in the gear section, Bone Storm is pretty insane for this. We're going to pick up Standalone, which is 18% damage reduction since we run 0 minions in this build. And we're also picking up Memento Mori, which basically says sacrificing both skeletal warriors and skeletal mages increase their sacrifice bonuses. And we'll get into the Book of the Dead in just a second. But of course, no minions in this build. And then finally, Rathma's Vigor. Increase your maximum life by 10%. After being healthy for 12 seconds, your next blood skill is basically a guaranteed overpower. And this is actually insane with Blood Mist. Moving on to the Book of the Dead, we're going to sacrifice the Skeletal Skirmishers to get 5% increased crit. We're going to sacrifice the Bone Mages to get 40% increased overpower damage. And finally, we're going to sacrifice the Blood Golem to get 10% increased life. And again, life will be a huge stat in this build. Okay, so let's talk about how this build works, right? So casting Bloodlance obviously consumes a lot of essence. And again, you're going to notice on our skill bar, we're running no generator. The only way we're able to regenerate essence is one, through essence regen, which is basically nothing. But most importantly, through the Grim Harvest, which consuming a corpse generates 6 essence. Now, doing this 1 corpse at a time would slowly refill our essence pool and really take away from the time that we're spamming Bloodlance. And so what we're sort of doing to solve this problem is we're going to be using the Black River. So the Black River says you consume up to 4 additional corpses, so 5 at once, to make Corpse Explosion do, X amount more damage and increase the radius by X amount. The reason this is really good in this build is because it consumes multiple corpses at once. So instead of spamming Corpse Explosion, 5 times to get 30 essence back, all you have to do is pop Corpse Explosion once and then poof, you get 30 essence. We're also stacking Corpse Explosion damage. We're getting corpse skills on our necklace. We're getting Corpse Explosion on our pants. So on the skill tree, we get up to plus 12 Corpse Explosion damage, which does actually make Corpse Explosion hit pretty darn hard. In addition to that, we are slowing and we are stunning. So they get 16% increased damage. But Corpse Explosion isn't obviously our main damage deal here. It is sort of how we deal with, a screen full of trash mobs. That is the way we clear the screen, because you don't really want to be fighting more than, say, like 30 mobs at a time with Bloodlance, because Bloodlance can only hit a maximum of 10 targets, even through all the ricochets. So really we want to sort of use Corpse Explosion to take care of like a screen full of mobs, leaving a bunch of corpses on the ground, so then we can start spamming Bloodlances, and then we can, pop 1 Corpse Explosion every now and then to sort of get our essence pool back up. And we're going to get a lot of extra juice through the Paragon board for consuming corpses. We also want to be consuming corpses because we have an aspect that makes a 30% chance when we consume a corpse to spawn a blood orb. Now, blood orbs are insanely good in this build because on the Paragon board, we have Blood Drinker. And Blood Drinker makes it so every single time we pick up a blood orb, we fortify for 7% of our maximum life. Now, this synergy is progressed even further by the brand new aspect, which says casting a blood lance will consume blood orbs. So it'll just consume them automatically. And it will also conjure blood lances from those blood orbs you consume. Each additional blood lance deals 20 to 50% of the normal damage and prioritizes targeting unlanced enemies. Why that unlanced enemy part is super important is because we're using another imprint. BloodLance deals 15 to 25% increased damage to primary target per lanced enemy. So if you have a bunch of targets lanced on the screen and you're attacking an elite, that calculation will go through the roof if there's a bunch of lanced enemies. So consuming corpses generates blood orbs. Every 6 casts of Bloodlance will make a blood orb, and a corpse tendrils has a 35% chance to make a blood orb spawn from an enemy when they damage it. But we're not done there. There's another Bloodlance aspect, which says each cast of Bloodlance will launch an additional Bloodlance at a nearby enemy when it first hits an enemy that is already lanced, dealing 57 to 72% of the normal damage. And we put this on our necklace because that is a lot of damage. So this is priority 1 as far as aspects go. So you can see between these 4 aspects that we just talked about, that is a lot of Bloodlance juice, a lot of Bloodlance synergy. But again, you're not really spamming Bloodlance when there's just an entire screen full of mobs. You're spamming Bloodlance when there's like 3 to 10 enemies on the screen. And Corpse Explosion, although it does great damage, is sort of just a support skill to increase your essence bar. Outside of that, we are using the Corpse Tendrils aspect. It gives 20% crit chance when you cast Corpse Tendrils and 40% bonus crit damage to enemies inside Corpse Tendrils. Now, some of you might be like, whoa, time out. Crit damage doesn't work with Overpower, and you'd be right. But for some reason, since this says bonus critical strike damage, when we do crit with BloodLance or when we do crit with Corpse Explosion, for some reason, this 40% additional critical strike damage is its own separate multiplier and is really, really quite good. And in our last offensive aspect here, whenever your blood skills overpower, which again, we have guaranteed overpower, a lot of guaranteed overpower in this build, you gain up to 50% attack speed for 4 seconds. And so that's going to make it so that we can shoot out tons of lances super duper fast. It also makes our proc rate of blood miss tick faster. So attack speed is really, really quite good in a blood build. Outside of that, we're running the standard increased armor on our defensive aspect. We are running Bone Storm for that additional aspect that gives 5% barrier every single time it hits. And although we try to stay at range with this build because there is damage to distant enemies, not only on our skill tree, but on the Black River itself. So staying at range is pretty good in this build. It will still hit a lot of enemies, and it's got a pretty big radius, and it will save your life, basically. So it's mostly a defensive cooldown. And then lastly, and sort of sadly, there's not a lot of great utility/defensive aspects for blood build in the current state of the game. However, crowd control duration is really good for this build because we want to sort of keep enemies CC'd if we can. We don't even want to give them a chance to hit us. We're gonna stun them, trap them in with Corpse Tendrils, and then while we're spamming blood lances, we'll pop a bone prison so that they get trapped inside that tiny circle. And if all the enemies are sort of juiced and dense together, all the blood lances are ricocheting really well, and you'll see that in the gameplay above. So 20% increased crowd control duration is really good. Plus, if enemies are unstoppable, we get a flat damage modifier to them. There's another aspect that says you gain, X amount of movement speed for 4 seconds and during unstoppable, so blood mist would apply that effect, and that could be nice for speed farming, but I think overall this is just a better aspect to put on your boots. Now, with a lot of the builds that we've been doing, it's sort of best to get as many boards as possible and get as many glyph sockets as possible. But with Overpower, it's not really the same. It's sort of best to stay within the boards that you choose. Now, we're still taking, I think we have 5 here. But fully speccing out these boards is actually better than sort of trying to rush the next glyph socket. So keep that in mind. But starting out, of course, we're going to go into the control. In the start board, this is just the best in slot for Necro currently to put the control glyph. There's so many points of intelligence to capture here, so you can get up to 128% increased damage to crowd controlled enemies. Moving on, we go to the Bloodbath board. Why the Bloodbath board second? Because all of the secondary effects that we're going to get from all these rare nodes, the sooner you attach a board, the lower the secondary stat requirement. And all these secondary stats are really, really good on this board. So we're going to get the glyph socket to get the sacrificial glyph. This gives 150% bonus to all magic nodes in range. And why that's good here is because we can get 12.5 damage while fortified with each of these magic runes, plus an additional 20% damage while fortified, plus 10% from the secondary bonus. So a ton of damage while fortified from this little part of the tree. We also want to pick up the legendary node that says attacks that are guaranteed overpower deal 50% increased damage. Now, if you guys didn't know, by default, you sort of have a 3% chance to apply overpower. There's no way to increase that chance. And so basically the only way to do overpower damage is to spec your character to do guaranteed overpowers. And so this makes this really, really good. So to get there, we're going to get these life nodes on the way. Later on, when you're nearing level 100, you're going to come up and get these additional ones as well. Damage while healthy, overpower damage is just insane. Damage while fortified, another 10% damage for the secondary. So again, we attach this board second because all of the rare secondary benefits are super good. The third board we like here is Blood begets Blood. We like to position the board this way so we can pick up overpower damage on the way to Blood begets Blood. That makes it so that when you get a blood orb, you get up to 50% increased damage for 5 seconds. And so again, our Blood Lance automatically consumes blood orbs and radius, which does apply this effect. So that's really, really cool. We don't have to run around and collect them because that's so dumb. On the way to the glyph, we pick up another rare rune. Damage for 8 seconds after picking up blood orb, which is just flat good, like we said, because we have auto pickup blood orbs. Moving into this section of the board, we pick up Undaunted. For every willpower and range, we do increase damage while fortified. And again, we're going to have perma fortified in this build. So this is really quite good. We also pick up these overpower nodes because again, we're an overpower build. That's a no-brainer. Later on, again, towards level 100, we're going to come up and get these extra nodes to get that extra maximum life. Again, maximum life is super important for overpower damage. Board number 4 is the Scent of Death board. And on the way to the Scent of Death, we're going to pick up more maximum life. But of course, with 2 corpses nearby, you gain 50% damage reduction. With no corpses nearby, 15% increased damage. So this is just flat good all the time for the Necromancer. And then moving down into the most important cluster on the Paragon board for overpower builds is picking up the Dominate glyph. There's a ton of willpower in this section. We get up to 291 overpower damage, which is just crazy. In addition to really good rare glyphs here, additional armor, additional damage to injured enemies. We path through that and basically move down to our final board, which is Flesh Eater. Flesh Eater, consuming 5 corpses, grant 40% increased damage for 6 seconds. We're consuming tons of corpses in this build because again, corpse explosion is how we generate essence. And on the way to Flesh Eater, we pick up the Stifle node, which is just damage to injured enemies. We don't care about the crit damage because again, you can't skill crit damage with overpower, but we have to pick up at least 1 crit damage node. And then we're using a second bonus to all magic nodes in range, and this is the Blood Drinker. This is super important because again, the secondary effect says when we pick up blood orbs, we fortify for 7% of our base life. So between this Fortify and the Bone Prison Fortify, we find that that's enough to keep up Fortify. And so we only need 40 in the radius. And the reason the magic node is so good here is because we can scale these damage to elites. We can get 60% increased damage to elites, plus another 16% from picking up this node. Now, another option for you while you're leveling is you can run the Bone Graft board and sort of rush the Essence on kill. That can make it a bit more consistent as you try to get more damage in the build. That's how I leveled personally. But later on, as you continue to scale your damage, as you increase your character's power, you can definitely drop it. It's not required. Again, this entire board will be linked in the video description below if you want to follow that to the T, which I would recommend, of course. Now, moving on to stat priorities. Stat priority is kind of funky, and it's actually kind of interesting and cool. Overpower can crit, but it doesn't scale off your crit damage. So stacking crit is super important, but you don't want to stack any sort of crit damage because it doesn't apply to your overpower. The other ways you can get more overpower damage is by increasing your life pool, because overpower uses your life pool plus the fortified life pool to determine its base damage. So increasing your life pool and stacking overpower damage are basically the only ways of increasing actual overpower damage. And of course, damage while healthy, damage while fortified, damage to distant, damage to close, all those normal ways of increasing damage will work. But again, crit damage, vulnerable damage do not work with overpower. So we do not concern ourselves with those, which actually opens up some cool gear possibilities. And it's sort of refreshing to not stack crit damage and vulnerable damage. So that being said, the helmets absolutely have to get maximum life. The highest possible roll you can get on life is sort of priority 1 here. Getting cooldown reduction. Cooldown reduction is super important for our Blood Mist cooldown. It's super important because of Wrathmist Vigor. You want to make sure that Blood Mist is up when you have your troll stacks of Wrathmist Vigor, because that 2 combo is just something you absolutely micromanage in this build because it's just so good. After that, armor is going to be rank 3, and then finally main stat that would be sort of the perfect helmet. For chest, rank 1 is again maximum life. This is not only a defensive stat, but it is our offensive stat. Is priority 1. It's getting the highest maximum life roll you can possibly get. Rank 2 is damage reduction while fortified. That is a flat damage reduction modifier and can go up to 15%. After that, you can get damage to close. I think damage to close is quite good here. I also think flat damage reduction is really good here. But ultimately, I think the perfect chest would be max life, flat damage reduction, armor percentage, and damage reduction while fortified. For gloves, the most important thing to get here is plus ranks to BloodLance. That, of course, will scale our BloodLance damage like crazy. And again, we are stacking Lucky in this build for a couple different reasons. One is because we use the Lucky hit modifier on the offhand to generate more essence. But 2, we are using the Hued Flesh to generate corpses when hitting enemies. Again, more corpses is more essence. And this particular node is super helpful against Nightmare Dungeon bosses. So gloves is a super important slot to get lucky on. We also are going to stack overpower damage and crit strike chance on the gloves. Attack speed would be a rank 5 here. So if you get some combo of those 5 stats, it's a pretty GG pair of gloves. For pants, I do think I have a best in slot idea. I think that max life obviously is rank 1. Damage reduction while fortified is rank 2. Corpse explosion damage or ranks is rank 3. But I think actually rank 4 will be ranks to Blood Mist and not Bone Prison. Getting more points in the Blood Mist, it doesn't increase its damage, but it does increase the cooldown. So again, just more consistent combo with the Blood Mist, or a defensive cooldown with the Blood Mist, and the 12 stacks for the guaranteed overpowered. Just that 2 combo is just too good. So just more consistently hitting that combo is super important. For boots, again, these aren't perfect. I think the perfect boots would be movement speed would be rank 1. Essence cost reduction would be rank 2. Damage reduction while injured would be rank 3. And then finally rank 4 would be main stat. On the necklace, I think the essence cost reduction and cooldown reduction are sort of super important. Corpse skills is super duper important. There's a lot of other passives you can get that are quite good. I happen to land imperfectly balanced, which is no slouch. It does stack overpower damage. So that gives me 12 or 20% increased damage to my BloodLance. I also really like Fueled by Death, because Fueled by Death will not only stack your BloodLance damage, but will actually stack your corpse explosion damage as well. So it hits both. So I kind of like that one too. Hitting Coalesce Blood or Tides of Blood. Those are both really, really good options as well. So there's a lot of things you can hit on a necklace that are going to be really good. For rings, you're looking for the Quadfecta, which I haven't hit. Rank 1 would be maximum life, as we talked about earlier. Rank 2, overpower damage. Rank 3, critical strike chance. And rank 4, lucky hit chance would be the perfect ring. And then finally, the offhand. Again, it sucks because I would really like to use a shield. If you can use a shield, you can increase your life pool. And again, more life is more overpower damage. But as we stated earlier, when we were talking about the aspects, there's just no good defensive or utility aspects for blood builds in the current state of the game. And we really need more offensive aspects. So we're running a focus. A two-hander would be great, but we have to use Black River because again, we don't want to sit there spamming corpse explosion to get essence back. We just want to hit it one time and get a big chunk. But on the offhand, one important stat that can roll is something called Lucky Hit, of up to 5% chance to restore up to 21% primary resource. And that actually procs a pretty decent amount, especially when the Bloodlance starts ricocheting. So that's going to be super duper important for keeping your essence sort of topped off as you spam trash mobs and stuff like that. Outside of that, after that, I'd probably say crit strike chance, cooldown reduction, and then probably lucky, since you can only roll 10% essence cost reduction on an offhand. I think this would be better suited with lucky cooldown, crit strike chance, and then the lucky restore. But I haven't seen one of those yet. Okay, so now we're in the section of the video where we're going to talk about all the sort of nuances. First up, I want to talk about skill rotation. Again, one of the biggest parts of this build is hitting your 12 stacks of Rathma's Vigor. And again, Rathma's Vigor doesn't seem really great on paper, but the reason this is really good is because when you pop your Blood Mist, which is a blood skill, it'll do insane amounts of overpower damage, and it ticks really, really fast. And this is based on your attack speed. So the more attack speed you get, the more ticks of this Blood Mist that sort of go off. And that's sort of why we talked about in the cooldown section of this video and the ranks to Blood Mist section of the video, because we sort of want these to line up. We want 12 stacks of the vigor to come up at the same time as the cooldown of Blood Mist. I like to lead with Blood Mist when we have the 12 stacks of vigor, because not only does it do insane amounts of damage, but also applies the aspect that increases our attack speed when we our blood skills overpower. So as soon as we come out of that, we're going to have that 50% increased attack speed. It also is going to drop 3 corpses on the ground because its duration is 3 seconds. So 1 corpse every second. That will set you up to do your next cast of corpse tendrils. So we're gonna, as soon as we're out of Blood Mist, we're gonna pop corpse tendrils. Corpse tendrils is gonna suck everything on top of that corpse. And since it's the start of the fight, we're sort of maximizing the utility of the corpse tendrils, because we're all about getting blood orbs. And corpse tendrils has a 35% chance per target hit to generate a blood orb. So this can just literally fill your screen with blood orbs, which is really, really good. This will also apply slow, and it'll apply stun, which again, we talked about earlier. We're getting an extra damage multiplier from Corpse Explosion. So after we come in, we Blood Mist, get out of Blood Mist, we're going to trigger our Corpse Tendrils. Everything's going to get sucked in. We're going to pop 1 cast of Corpse Explosion to get our stacks of the Flesh Eater as a flat damage modifier for our Blood Lance. And then we're literally just going to start spamming Blood Lances as fast as we can, watching our essence pool and hitting another Corpse Explosion if we feel like we're getting low, or if we want more blood orbs. Another thing you can do, again, as we are sort of monitoring our essence pool, we want to use Bone Prison, not just sort of a way to control mobs, but it is a great way of getting essence back. If we just trap one enemy, we get 25 essence back immediately. And of course, Corpse Tendrils will stack everything together. So this will immediately fill up our entire bar of essence if we trap a bunch of enemies in here. So you really need to use Corpse Explosion. You really need to use Bone Prism like intelligently and effectively to get essence pool back, so we don't have to waste a skill slot for a generator. As stated before, Bone Storm is literally just a defensive cooldown here. It is nice that it gives you 15% or 20% chance to crit, because crit is good. But we sort of use this on the fly if we feel we're about to fight, maybe a cold enchanted pack or something that's really dangerous. I want to make sure we pop this, go in with our Blood Mist, and this will just stack a whole bunch of barrier while the Blood Mist is triggering. But another thing is, once you sort of, you're spamming Blood Lances, you want to make sure you pay attention to your stacks of vigor, because again, you can sink multiple casts of the combo of Blood Mist and vigor in a fight. So you do want to sort of micromanage that 12 stacks. And this is going to be really, really prevalent on bosses. And so we're going to talk about bosses real quick. So map bosses, Nightmare Dungeon bosses, unless you cast everything perfectly, you're going to run out of essence. And that's sort of why we mentioned earlier in the video, you can bring Hemorrhage down to your bar. So on bosses, it just makes them super duper easy. You can swap that skill, and you can actually swap skills mid-fight. So it's not that big of a deal. But you don't need to if you're casting your rotation perfectly. You're going to go into a boss, you're going to have your 12 stacks of vigor, you're going to go in, you're going to Blood Mist, you're going to have 3 corpses on the ground, you're going to cast Tendrils, you're going to like spam a few Blood Lances, and then once your essence pool goes down a bit, you're going to try to trap them with the prison, get your essence pool back up, spam more lances, and as you're spamming more lances, you want to be watching your vigor, and when the vigor hits 12 again, you're going to hit your Blood Mist, get those 3 corpses again, explode those corpses, and sort of rinse and repeat that to sort of keep your essence pool up and play that boss perfectly. The other couple quirks I wanted to touch on real quick is sort of bugs that exist with this build. So one, every once in a while, you're going to go in with your Blood Mist and you're going to have your 12 stacks of Wrathmist Vigor up, and for some reason, it's not going to trigger the overpower. It's just a known bug. It happens sometimes. There's really nothing you can do about it. The other thing that's super duper weird, and is also a known bug, I've reported it with Blizzard, but sometimes when you're full on Fortify and you pick up a blood orb, it will pop Fortify and then immediately it'll drop off. And you'll keep picking up blood orbs, and no matter how many blood orbs you pick up, it won't keep you fortified. I think this is due to, one, there's sort of a weird interaction between stacking Fortify in multiple different ways, and I think they're interfering with each other. But two, I think because the blood orbs heal you, you don't want to heal yourself when you have Fortify, because it makes Fortify fall off. So I think the fact that they heal you and give you Fortify is sort of like canceling each other out. But you'll notice that sometimes, like Fortify will just drop off, even though you just picked up like 20 blood orbs. It seems like you should have like infinite Fortify, but it just falls off. So that's sort of a known bug. The last thing I want to touch on is potions, right? Don't use your potion. Now, of course, if you're going to die, use your potion. But if you're fortified, don't use your potion. Use the blood orbs to heal yourself back up to full. Use your life on kill from using a one-hand scythe, because the inherent stat is life on kill. Use those to heal you back to full. Depend on those to heal you back to full. Do not use a potion, because as soon as you use a potion, your fortify will fall off. Touching on gems, of course, in the armor slots, we're going to be using rubies because they give you maximum life, as we touched on. And stat priority, maximum life is just more overpowered damage, and it's a defensive layer. All said and done, if you had perfect life rolls, you could probably get over 20,000 health, which is just pretty nutty. And the weapons as well, we're going to be using rubies because they are flat overpowered damage, 24% per ruby. And then jewelry slots, we're using armor. They still haven't fixed all resistance, so armor is still the best and slot for the jewels. Of course, in season 1, we'll have malignant hearts. And again, stop by the stream if you want to find out what the best in slot is for those. But again, we wanted to present this as sort of a non-seasonal build. This is something that's going to stay in the game. It doesn't depend on any seasonal theme. The last thing we want to mention is we did try the blood chest, which consumes 5 blood orbs to spawn a free bone spirit. We even got plus 16 to bone spirit, and the BloodLance just still hit harder than the bone spirit, even though it was really cool to see the auto consume BloodLance would sort of spit out these bone spirits, and it was really cool to see, and it looked really neat to have those blow up. It really just didn't do any damage, even fully stacking it. So I did consider that as well, but ultimately we decided to move away from it because we just felt it didn't really add anything to the build. That's gonna do it for the video. I've really been enjoying this playstyle. It's probably my second favorite build that I've made for the Necromancer under Shadowmancer. I'm excited to see what the Malignant Hearts can do for all the builds that we've created. I do want to say real quick that all 3 builds that we've made so far for the Necromancer, that's the Minion Mancer, the Shadowmancer, and now the BloodLancer, all 3 got buffed, did not suffer any nerfs with the recent nerfs in Diablo 4. So do check those out depending on the kind of playstyle you want to go for the Necromancer. But as always, guys, leave comments in the comment section below if you think that there's something I've missed here. We've been playtesting this very diligently for the past week and a half. But also sound off, what are you going to start in Season 1? Which necro build are you going to play, and why is it one of my necro builds? If you guys like the build guide, obviously drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Necromancer content. As always, come over to the Twitch channel, hang out. We'll be there streaming the season start. Stay up to date on what's going on with the stream and Diablo 4 by following me on Twitter. And if you guys like dumb IRL content, do follow me on Instagram. But as always, like, subscribe, come over to Twitch, ask your questions. We love you guys. Peace out.